Thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conference. It's great to be with you today, and I'm looking forward to talking to you about this topic, which I've been involved in for a year now or so. It's evolving trends in English language teaching and professional practices. So you can see the framework, the British Council Continuing Professional Development Framework for Teachers there on the right-hand side. I think probably most of you are familiar with that. This conference is sort of based around those 12 professional practices. But a year or so ago, the British Council asked myself and a colleague, Gary Mottram, to look at this framework and see if it was still fit for purpose in 2024 and beyond. This was quite a big project, and it had 4 main phases. So the first phase was a big desk-based review. And then after that, we tested consensus with the findings from that review. Then based on those findings, we revised the framework. And then phase 4 was testing consensus again to produce the final version of the revised framework. So the first phase, as I said, was a big desk-based review. And this was by far the longest phase of the project. And we had 3 research questions that we were trying to answer in this phase. So the first one was, how has English language teaching changed in the last 10 years? Because remember, the framework was originated in 2013, and we were doing this at the end of 2023, 2024. So it was looking at 10 years. How has teacher education changed in the last 10 years? And then finally, how have descriptions of teacher competence changed in the last 10 years. So we looked at lots of different types of literature. You can see on the left-hand side there that we did general searches. We looked at some specific journals. We looked at global education reports, publishing houses. And you'll see in the middle column there that we actually reviewed a vast variety of literature. So this ranged from very academic articles to blog posts, to global education reports, and even to webinars that have been produced by different publishing houses. We didn't want to just focus on the academic literature. We thought it was very important to have practitioner perspectives as well. So even the 2 of the main journals we chose for research question 1, the English Language Teaching Journal and TESOL Journal, have a bit more of a practitioner perspective, and that's why we chose them. But we also looked at regional journals, top regional journals, to see what they were saying, how things were varying across the globe. And obviously, when you're looking at blog posts and things like that, you need to take into account that these are quite personal reflections, but they also tend to be quite current, whereas we know that sometimes the academic literature can take time to come out, and the blog posts were actually very recent, very current. Again, publishing houses, they're very self-interested, they want to sell their wares. But again, it was helping us to see the sorts of issues that they were responding to in those webinars, which again are quite current. So the main thing that we did really was to code. We went through every article in English Language Teaching Journal, in TESOL Journal, and in TESOL Quarterly, and all of the special issues as well, and we coded them. Those codes were taking the main topic or theme of that paper or that blog post as well, and looking at and getting codes from there. And then what we did was really amalgamate those codes into themes. So for example, reading, writing, speaking, listening were all amalgamated under skills. And then we began to map those themes to the professional practices in the current framework. And then what we did was that we created these heat maps, and this is what you have an example of here. So we looked at how many articles were coded under that theme, and we counted really the numbers of articles that were being produced under that theme. So you can see here, for example, that multiple language use in ELT, we have 17 articles in 2023 under that code. 9 in 2022, 11 in 2021, 17 in 2020, 10 in 2019, with a total of 64 articles in total coded under that theme. So that enabled us to create these heat maps and see the sort of articles or the sorts of topics that had more research papers or more posts on them. So multiple language use in ELT was the top theme, with 64 articles in total. You have the top 5 here. Digital technologies had 60, inclusion 47, vocabulary and lexis 42, skills 37. And then we have the bottom 2, policy and grammar. So what did we find from all this? I don't think that we found anything really new, but what we did find that there were certain areas that there was a lot more importance attached to them. And we also found that there was a broadening of these 5 things that you can see on the screen here. So a broadening of the context that people were talking about in terms of English language teaching, a broadening of the idea of who's teaching English today, a broadening understanding of who the learners are and what their needs are, a broadening of the nature of English language teaching, and a broadening of the variety and standard of the sort of English that's being taught. And I'm just going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail. So a lot of the articles, it was really interesting to see the global authorship of these articles written by people from all over the world. And there is this understanding, this growing understanding that actually there are so many different contexts of teaching and learning English today. So people are teaching even within countries, in urban areas, in rural areas, in areas which are very remote, hard to reach. We have the private sector, the public sector. A lot of learning now is taking part online. More and more hybrid learning as well, that mix of online and face-to-face. And then, of course, the traditional or more traditional face-to-face context as well. And there's also growing awareness of teaching and learning in very complex contexts. So there's a lot of conflict zones, for example, refugee camps, areas of natural disasters where teaching and learning is taking place. And then, of course, the pandemic caused an extra complexity. So lots of information, lots of articles written about these different contexts. Also, this broadening of who's teaching English today. So I think there's always been an awareness that most teachers in the world are actually not native speakers, but we are beginning to see more and more of a shift away from a focus on the native speaker as the model, and a growing awareness. There's still work to be done, but that most teachers in the world are actually L2 speakers, and many of those teachers are multilingual themselves. There's also this shift to recognise that much English in the world is being taught by subject teachers. These are people who are teaching subjects like geography or history through the medium of English, and perhaps haven't actually been trained as English language teachers, but are having to teach in English. So there's also an understanding, or a broader understanding, of learners. English is becoming, more and more countries are introducing English and making it compulsory in primary school, even in kindergarten. So a lot of our learners today are much younger than they were before. There's also an awareness that many learners themselves are multilingual, and they come with very different linguistic resources, and it's how can we use those and capitalize on those in the classroom. There's also this focus on learner well-being, particularly since the pandemic, and how we can encourage well-being among learners in our English language classes, and learner identity, everything that they bring to the classroom. That might be in terms of their ethnicity, their age, their gender, their socioeconomic background, their educational background, their needs. This was perhaps the largest part of the of the review. So we see that English is still being taught as a subject in many parts of the world. So we have English as a foreign language, English as a second language, English as an additional language in the UK, America, places like Australia. But there's also a real growth in English medium instruction and in content and language integrated learning. That's CLIL. So as I said, many more subject teachers teaching through the medium of English. There's also growth in continuing growth in communicative language teaching and task-based language teaching. Communicative language teaching in particular is forming more and more a part of national curriculums, but a lot of the research papers, especially the regional ones, that say that there's quite a piecemeal sort of attempt to actually integrate that into curriculums, and a lot of teachers don't actually practice it in the classroom. Real growth in digital technology, ICTs, particularly since the pandemic. I don't think that's probably surprising. And all of these things have an impact on pedagogy and on methodology. So we have multilingual approaches becoming more and more popular. Things like translanguaging and how learners can use all the languages at their disposal in the classroom to communicate. And this feeds into things like inclusion, equity. There's also thinking around how we can tackle global issues in the English language classroom, things like sustainability, things like social justice, and then how we can develop these growing 21st century skills or transferable skills in our learners. Things like employability skills, critical thinking, critical literacies, critical pedagogies, all of these things are becoming more and more or are growing in the literature. And then finally, we have this broadening of the variety and standard of English being taught today. So again, this move away from the native speaker Englishes, native speaker standards, and people are looking at how we can teach English as a lingua franca or English as an international language. There's talk about global Englishes and even local Englishes, which are relevant to particular contexts.